Good to see you. How was your week? A couple of you had a good week. Just want to leave that. Just hang in there. Hang in there. Let's open our Bibles together for a few minutes. Matthew chapter 18. Get your bullets out, turn it over. We'll take a few notes as we go along. What does it take to be a great Christian? Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 1. It says that at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens?" Who is the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens? Matthew makes a point here saying at that time. So we need to kind of look at the context and ask ourselves, what time is he talking about? And when we do that, we find out that this is a period of Jesus' ministry where things have changed. He has begun to let his disciples know that time is approaching rapidly when he will go to Jerusalem and he will be crucified. They're not sure what to think about this. They don't know what all of that means. They won't fully understand it until it's over. But he's preparing them for it because it's going to be intense. And they, in the midst of all of this may sound strange, but in the midst of all of this, with Jesus talking about his persecution and his crucifixion, they decide that this is the right time to argue among themselves about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom of heavens. Yeah, people of God can be really lovable at times. And other times they can be really rascally, you know. Someone said to live above with the saints we love. That would be glorious. To live below with the saints we know. That's another story. It wasn't a good day, but Jesus takes advantage of the situation and he teaches them something important that he wants us to know. So let's look at this text and see how he answers this question. Look at the next verse, verse 2. It says that Jesus summoned a child, and he stood the child among them. And he said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of the heavens." Now let's make sure we're all on the same page here. To be in the kingdom of the heavens, of course, is to be a follower of Jesus, to be right with God. It's to know that we're on our way to heaven and not to hell. It's to know that we're forgiven. It's to know that we have God's blessing in our life. It's also to know, church, that even the adversities that we face in this life are going to be used by God to bring about a great victory in our life. We must never forget that part. It's true to be a follower of Jesus is to be blessed and be on our way to heaven, but we've got to remember that it also means that the adversities we face are used by God to bring great victory in our life. Now, everybody faces adversities. The only question is what's going to come out of it. And for those of us who are following Jesus, we know something good is going to come out of it because God will not allow those adversities into our life to crush us, because that's not his goal. His goal is not to crush us. His goal is to build us up and to strengthen us. So if they were waiting for him to pick one of the 12, if they asked this question saying, they covertly kind of make it sound general. Well, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? But I think the subtext here is, which one of us? Which one of us is greatest? Because you see, Jesus, we've been talking about it and we can't decide. We've seen you favor Peter a little bit. You've favored Peter and James and John a little bit. You know, they got to go up on the mountain and we did the rest of us. And we got to thinking about this. Who's really going to be the greatest? Who do you think? And if they thought he was going to choose one of them, they had another thing coming. He surprised them. He brings a child in. And not only that, he surprises them by saying, you know what, guys? You're talking about greatness in the kingdom of heavens, but what you really need to be thinking about is entering the kingdom of heavens. Did you notice that switch? They talked about greatness, and he said, unless you change and become like children, you won't even enter the kingdom of heavens. Forget about being great. Worry about getting in the door. So Jesus kind of treats them the same way he did Nicodemus in John chapter 3. He says, unless you're born again, you won't see the kingdom of heavens. You won't even enter the kingdom of heavens. So you need to understand, we need to understand what God is looking for. And Jesus uses this picture of a child. He says, you've got to be like a little child. Well, what does he mean by that? You know, kids are great things. They're wonderful to have around. They're not 100% good. You know, they can be aggravating sometimes. We were all kids one time too, right? I'm sure we'd agree, we probably wouldn't even think seriously for a moment that Jesus is saying we should be childish to be in the kingdom of heaven. It's childlike, not childish. But what does he mean specifically by that? What is it about a child that it is that we need to change and be like to ensure that we'll enter the kingdom of heaven? Well, look what he says in the next verse. In verses 4 and 5, he says, for the one who humbles, the one who will humble himself like one of these children, that's the one who is great in the kingdom of heaven. And the one who receives, such as this little child, in my name, receives me. Now, Jesus started to make a little bit of a shift here away from speaking of a child literally. Remember, the child here, as we look at this text today, remember the child is being used as a figure, as a symbol. It's a figure of speech. All of these things apply to children, but he's comparing children to those who are followers of Jesus, the little ones. In fact, from this point forward in this text, he's going to call them the little ones and not the children. He starts out with children and he switches to little ones like these. So there's a transition that's taking place here. But here specifically, Jesus says, what it is about children that you need to embrace and be a follower of mine is their humility. Kids know that they need somebody else to make it through the day. That's never a question in a child's mind. A child knows when he or she gets in the car that someone else is going to drive that car. A child knows that when they go on a trip, they don't put money in their pocket to pay for the meals or the train ticket or the plane ticket or any of that. They just know that there's an adult there who's going to handle all of those details. That's part of being a child. Then we grow up and we take over those things for ourselves. But as long as we're children, we live in this constant state of dependence, of knowing that we're depending on somebody else for all of the things that are important in our lives. As Jesus is saying, until you figure out that you're totally and utterly dependent upon God, then you haven't entered into the kingdom of heaven yet. There's some arrogance in you. There's some selfishness that still needs to be expelled. Jesus, it says in the Bible, is the model for this. In Philippians chapter 2, it says that he emptied himself of his glory and he came to earth. He didn't just come to earth, he came as a man. He didn't just come as a man, he came as a servant. He didn't just come as a servant, he came and offered his life. He didn't just come and offer his life, he gave his life in the most brutal and gruesome way that we can imagine. He died on a cross. So Jesus went all the way to the bottom. He humbled himself completely and entirely. He said, my life is completely in the hands of God. Whatever God chooses for me, that's what's going to happen. So he's the example. That's a tough example because it's a hard example to follow. But that wonderful hymn in Philippians chapter 2 begins with these words that challenge us to be like him. If you read the beginning of that chapter, we take that hymn out of context and we celebrate the Christology of that hymn. It talks about the beauty of Jesus Christ and what he has done for us and how God exalted him after that was over because he put himself in his hands. But the very beginning of that chapter tells us that the reason that hymn is there is for us to ponder what Jesus did and ask ourselves how we can do the same thing. When we get to Matthew chapter 25, God willing, Jesus is going to teach us about the day of judgment. And he's going to say this, whatever you did to the least of these, there's that idea again, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. And so not only did Jesus humble himself, but he identified with those who are humble. The outcasts, the people who are unimportant in our culture. And he makes it clear who he's talking about in Matthew 25. If we were to ask, well, who are you talking about, Jesus? It's right there. He says, the people who are hungry, the people who are thirsty, the people who are naked, the people who are sick, the people who are in prison, and the people who are strangers and outcasts. That's who I'm talking about. That's who Jesus identifies with. And to be a follower of Jesus, to be in the kingdom, is to be like him, is to be a humble person. Let's write something down. Here's the first question today. Why is humility so great? Because we don't exactly embrace humility in our culture. We give it lip service. We like people who act humble, but we really don't like people who are humble. It's one thing to say the words, it's something else to do the deeds. It's something else to not have power. It's something else to not have privilege. It's something else to really be last in line. And Jesus came and stood at the end of the line with everybody who's last in line. So what is so great about humility, especially in a culture that celebrates celebrity, that celebrates ability, that celebrates power? What is so great about humility? Well, it's big, but it's simple. Here it is. Why is humility so great? Because Jesus identifies with humble people. Jesus identifies with humble people. Now, the implication there is that if we're not humble, that we can't connect with Jesus. Let me say that again. The implication is that if we're not truly humble, that there is a disconnect between us and Jesus. We just don't get Jesus. We don't understand him. And so we certainly aren't going to follow him because he makes no sense. Why would somebody give up all their power and their privilege? Why would somebody give up all of their abundance? We work all of our lives trying to gather it and to protect it and get as much as we can. And Jesus says, you don't understand who I am. You don't understand what I'm about. That's not what greatness is in the kingdom of the heavens. Let's see what he says after this. Back in verse 5, he says, but the one who receives one such as these little ones, in my name, notice the identification, receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better if they had a large millstone tied around their neck and they were drowned in the depths of the seas. Woe to the world for its stumbling blocks. Stumbling blocks have to come, but woe to the man through whom a stumbling block comes. Now notice here, he's shifted completely from children to little ones. He's talking about his followers. Followers of Jesus are little ones in the world. I know in our country we like to exercise our political power and think of ourselves as a voting bloc that can change things. But the fact is, it's God who changes things, not us. And we just have to recognize our dependence upon him. And that's what he's telling us. You need to recognize that you're utterly, moment by moment, day by day, completely dependent on the Lord. And he says here that part of this is recognizing these other little ones and saying, we need to watch out for these other little ones. The last thing I want to do is make them stumble. When he says stumble, he means to sin. He means to cause someone to do something that would cause them to stumble in their faith, to be pulled away from the Lord instead of guided toward the Lord. There are a lot of stumbling blocks in our culture, church. Have you noticed that? You go outside those doors and you live in that world, and that world will pull you away from Jesus. That world makes fun of Jesus and those who follow Jesus. That world denigrates prayer, one of the tap root of our spiritual truth, our spiritual empowerment. Prayer is denigrated out there. The idea of faithfulness in your relationships, especially with the opposite sex, is also considered foolishness in that world. All of those things that draw us closer to Jesus out there, they are turned on their heads. And Jesus is saying here, if you're going to follow me, you got to be humble enough to reject all of that, and don't be part of causing other people to stumble. Now, notice the responsibility here. He's not just saying, don't you stumble. He's saying, don't you make someone else stumble. Recognize the spiritual weakness in yourself and in your brothers and sisters in Christ. You need each other. The last thing that we need to do is cause each other to stumble. It's a shocking picture that he has here. The millstone, literally it says the millstone of a mule. None of our English translations put the mule in there, the donkey. But it's a large, round piece of stone that they used to roll over another large piece of stone flat on the ground and crush grain. And it was so big that a mule or a donkey had to be tied to it to pull it around because no one else could pull it. And so Jesus is saying, if you've got that tied to your neck and you're thrown in the sea, you're out of here. It's over with. And Jesus is saying that it would be better to die than to cause somebody else to sin. Now, stay with me. Because you might be saying, oh my goodness, I think I've caused somebody else to sin. I'm in trouble. But Jesus, as is often the case, He uses these this hyperbole, these figures of speech that really get our attention. He's saying here that if we have a lifestyle that causes others to sin, then that's not a life worth living. We need to get rid of that life, and we need another life, a different life. Okay? Look what he says next in verses 8 and 9. He says, if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It would be better to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands and 2 feet and to be thrown into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to sin, plug it out, throw it away. It would be better to enter into life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into a fiery hell. Now, first of all, let me say that Jesus, again, is using hyperbole, figures of speech. He loves parables. There's no indication that his followers, that the early church, or for 2,000 years, any version of the church, has taken this literally, and people have poked their eyes out, cut their hands off, and cut their feet off. So if you're a real literal thinker, slow down just a little bit, okay? Don't go out and maim yourself. As Jesus is making a point here, he's saying that it's so important to not sin that it would be better to lose something that's important in your life than to give in and sin. Jesus also talking about another thing that's very uncomfortable in our culture. It's hell, and he mentions it twice. But Jesus doesn't have a problem warning us about the realities of Judgment Day. Judgment Day is not something we like to talk about in our culture. In fact, a lot of people are banking on the fact that there is no Judgment Day. It'll be okay. I'm looking at the field out there, and I'm thinking I'm maybe better than some, worse than others. So even if there is a Judgment Day, I'm going to be good. But that's not the way Judgment Day works, the Bible says. The Bible says that nobody's going to be able to stand on their own good works on Judgment Day. We're going to have to become like little children and recognize our utter dependence on the grace of God. That's the only way to get into the kingdom. Kids don't work their ways into being part of the family. They're born into the family. And we don't work our way into heaven. We have to be born again. We have to become like children once again. Now, if you've been following along for the last couple of years, you may remember that Jesus has already used this teaching, something very much like it, back in Matthew chapter 5. The idea of cutting off the hand, gouging out the eye. Back then, though, he used it for personal sin, for lust, in fact, is what he was talking about in Matthew chapter 5. Now, it's in a different context. This is a reminder that Jesus taught these things over and over and over again. He used the same words in different places. And sometimes he put them in slightly different contexts and they made a little bit of a different point. Here, it seems out of place at first until we stop and realize what Jesus is saying. Jesus is making the point here that the last thing we want to do is cause someone else to sin. He's giving us responsibility for one another. He's saying it's not enough for you to just work on yourself. It's not enough for you to just work on yourself. That won't do it. You need to work on yourself and making sure that you protect one another. This is a community event. It's a group project. Christianity always is, still is, and always will be a group project. There are no Lone Ranger Christians. Lone Ranger Christians, well, in reality, they just don't exist. Because when we're Christians, we become part of the community. We become part of the family. We become a citizen in the kingdom of God, which is what they're talking about. So what he's saying here is your sin is important, not just because of you. Your sin is important because of your brother and sister in Christ. So the next time I sin, I should ask myself, how will this sin cause someone else to stumble? If I don't care enough about myself to keep me out of sin, maybe I'll care enough about you to keep me out of sin so that I don't cause you to stumble. So what is Christian humility? Let's write it down. Second question. What is Christian humility? Well, first of all, it's more than words. It is actions. It's more than words, it's actions. We kind of expect people to say humble things. You know, the great athlete or musician or whatever, the actor or actress, we sort of expect them to say humble things, but it's really just kind of facade. We really want them to be, our culture, that is, really likes people who are they're good at something. They look good. They act good. They have a lot of stuff. I mean, that's who they write. That's who the magazine articles are about. And it's just kind of understood that they might say a few words every now and then that are comfortable. But it's just a cover. And Jesus is saying, I'm not talking about humility. It's just sort of an attitude or a few words you throw at, oh gosh, gee, not me. You know, he's not talking about that. He's talking about a real humble life where someone has lowered themselves to a lower station. Jesus said, when you go to the party and all the popular people are sitting on one end of the room and the unpopular people are sitting on the other end of the room, don't go down there and sit with the popular people. He said, go down here and you sit in the lowest place you can find. Because if you go up there, then somebody will come in and say, excuse me, but this chair is for somebody else, and you'll be humiliated in front of everybody else. But if you're down here with the low people, then maybe God will come and elevate you. See, all of this humility is about one thing. It's about believing that God will elevate us, God will give the victory, but He does it His way and in His timing, not mine. Not mine. I'm waiting on Him. I'm simply faithful. I put myself in a low position, and I wait for God to come and say, Richard, it's time for you to move up to a better place in the faith. And until then, I'm perfectly happy with wherever I happen to be. Jesus is saying, just like a child, you're dependent. Be happy with what you've got. So it's more than words, it's actions, it's putting others before self. That's easy, we know that. You can write it down, putting others before self. Look at the last verse this morning, verse 10. Jesus says, watch out that you don't look down on one of the least of these. So I tell you that there are angels in the heavens always see the face of my Father in the heavens. Now this is a fun verse. This is a verse, one of those verses, there's a lot of them in the Bible, where we almost immediately get pulled away from the main point of what's going on. You know? This happens constantly. In revealing His truth, God says things that they sound fascinating. And angels are always fun to talk about. People get fascinated with angels and demons. What are they like? How do they work? And so forth. And a lot of times we get pulled away from the main point of the gospel and we start talking about all this other stuff. This verse raises the issue of a guardian angel. This is one of the verses that people like to go to and say, see, the Bible teaches that everybody has a guardian angel. Maybe so. The language here really doesn't support it. The language is more communal. It doesn't say anything about an individual person having an individual angel. Now, that may be the case, but I'm just telling you, this verse doesn't teach that. The Bible clearly teaches that nations have angels. Read the book of Daniel. The Bible clearly teaches that churches have angels. Read the book of Revelation. You can join us on Sunday night. We're doing that right now. But the teaching about whether or not individuals have an individual angel assigned to them, I'm thinking of a movie that we watch around Christmas time. What is that? It's a Wonderful Life. Have you ever seen that? Now, there's an angel, isn't it? What was his name? Clarence. Yes. Well, I tell you, if I have an angel, well, I'm not saying. I don't know about the Clarence guy. But anyway, the Bible is a little ambiguous about the idea that individuals may have angels. We're not sure about that, but we know this. Angels are here to help us out. They're here to help God's people. Whether we're assigned 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, they're here to help us. And why would we want 1 when we can have 10,000? But that's not the point of this verse. The point of this verse is that these little ones are so important to God that He does assign angels to, be they in bulk or whatever. And that those angels have access to the face of God. And that's royal language for your importance. And this is another reminder that what we see with our natural eyes is not necessarily what's really going on in the spiritual realm. Because we see with our natural eyes people who look unimportant and they're last in line. And Jesus is saying here, if you could just see the angels, you would realize how important those people are to God. Maybe not to this world. So let's write down the last thing. What is the threat? What threatens Christian greatness Because remember, to be a great Christian is to be humble, to lower ourselves like Jesus. What is the threat to that? Jesus said it very easily here. It's something I think that people in general just struggle with. I will admit to it. I can think of instances when I've looked down on people based on their appearances and so forth. I don't mind saying that out loud. I apologize. I don't want to be that way. I don't know why I'm that way. But it just seems like part of our nature. We judge by appearances a lot of times. God is saying, watch out. Be careful when you start judging by appearances. Because God judges the hearts. We need to be able to see things the way He sees things. So what threatens Christian greatness? Well, here's what I put down. I struggled with this week. I wrote several things down, and this is what I ended up with. False pride. Pride can be good. You know, there's good pride. Jeremiah said, let the one who boasts, boast in this, that he knows and understands the Lord. That's good pride. When we boast in what God has done, when we boast in Jesus and what He's done for us in the past. False pride is when we boast in what we can do apart from God, because we really can't do it apart from God. I was reminded this week as I studied this passage of a term that I didn't hear until the 1990s, which seems so long ago now. But there was, Karen and I were living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area at this time, in Benton actually, and there was a lot of discussion about different movements within the Christian tradition. I heard a term that I'd never heard before. The term was spiritual pride. Spiritual pride. And that sounded odd to me, because I always thought, well, if somebody is spiritual, then they wouldn't be prideful. It sounded like an oxymoron to me. But here, the conversation was about the so-called charismatic movement at the time. This is what people were talking about, the spiritual pride that was being fostered by the charismatic movement. It was a group of people who took what the Bible calls a minor spiritual gift and elevated it to a position of determining who were great and who were not great. And at this time, throughout the 80s and 90s, this kind of thinking had infiltrated a lot of churches, divided a lot of churches, and destroyed a lot of spiritual lives. And so we were talking about spiritual pride. But as I thought about this, it dawned on me, there's no one group that has a corner on the market of spiritual pride. You can find spiritual pride in all Christian traditions. There's a lot of spiritual pride in mainline Christianity today. You know, trying to be like the world and agree with the world on all of their crazy ideas. Well, you know, maybe the Bible's not true, but all that matters is we just love one another. You love us, we'll love you, you love us. There's a lot of pride involved in that. There are some Christians who are very scholastic, very intellectual in their approach to the Bible. I don't mind naming names this morning. I've already started, so I'm going to keep going. Calvinists, you know, they tend to be real arrogant. Everybody says those Calvinists, they're arrogant. Well, some of them are. They're prideful. I've known some Calvinists, they seem to be trying harder to lead me to Calvin than to lead me to Jesus. You know, I didn't understand that. Spiritual pride. Baptists. Do Baptists have spiritual pride? Oh, my goodness. I won't take too much time. One of the problems with Baptists is we tend to be legalistic. Legalistic. We think that approaching God has to do with rules. You know, we want to live holy and righteous lives here, but we get confused. We don't understand grace sometimes. And legalistic Christians can be really arrogant and prideful because they're better than you. And Jesus says, watch out that you don't look down at somebody else. Watch out. Because the Bible says pride comes before what? Pride comes before fall. Well, I'll tell you something I've learned about God the hard way is God will clip your wings. He will clip your wings in a minute. I know because mine hurts. Jesus said, watch out. Don't you look down on those little ones. In fact, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you better become